All right, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chitra Golestani, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Wilmette Institute's webinar entitled A Framework for Unity, the Shared Humanity Between African American and Indigenous Peoples. As many of our viewers know, the Wilmette Institute is an online educational institution providing university and extension courses dedicated to the building of a new society through transformative education. Our interdisciplinary courses aim to develop the capacity of participants to contribute meaningfully to the current discourses of society, exploring both spiritual and material dimensions of our collective advancement. Our educational endeavors, including courses, certificate programs, and webinars, aim to inspire a commitment to social transformation, drawing upon a Baha'i conceptual framework in areas of community building, contributing to discourse, and social action. Before we get started today, I have a few announcements. We are looking ahead to 2 extension courses, one starting in November. On November 6th, the course Building a New System of Global Governance will be offered. And on November 20th, we will have Introducing the Kitab al-Aqdas for Deepening Devotion and Discourse. For more information and registration, please access the Wilmette Institute website. Furthermore, our next webinar will be on October 27th. It will be on the solutionary way with Zoe Weil, who actually was my former boss at the Institute for Humane Education. Her work is really amazing pedagogically and otherwise. So don't forget to mark your calendars for that. Register on our website, please. Also, before we get started, I want to mention that, our website, our webinar will be live streamed on YouTube and accessible later on SoundCloud, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So we really hope that you enjoy the program and invite, others to view it and share it with others on social media as well. During the presentation, you're invited to post questions in the Q&A section, some of which will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Now I have the pleasure to introduce the webinar for today entitled A Framework for Unity, the Shared Humanity Between African Americans and Indigenous Peoples with Dr. Michael Orona. Dr. Michael Orona has served in the U.S. Department of State for over 20 years, where he has held an array of senior-level foreign policy advisory positions, including serving at the White House as National Security Council Director for African Affairs and overseeing the President's executive orders on racial equity. He currently serves as the State Department's Senior Advisor for International Indigenous Issues and co-leads the White House Subcommittee on International Indigenous Rights. His forthcoming book, The Brave Ones, is a history of the Yakai people and will be released in October 2024. Without further ado, we welcome Dr. Orona. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Teacher, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I will share my screen and we can get started. Great. Making sure that people can see my screen, okay?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. And again, Chitra, thank you for the introduction. I'm truly honored to be here. I want to thank first and foremost, the Wilmette Institute for the opportunity to join you and especially for giving Indigenous peoples a platform to share our thoughts and perspectives. So I look forward tonight to sharing my perspective as an Indigenous person on a framework for race unity. Before we get started, it is customary for Native peoples to introduce ourselves in our native language. So I would like to introduce myself in my father's language of Apache. Inde biate danisho inde nishli dishi asan shishe. Ina biate Michael Orona shishe. Shema nakayi yome yaki. Hike shita chehen inde. Thank you again. And also, before we begin, I need to state that I am a U.S. government official, as was mentioned, and the thoughts and ideas expressed tonight are my own as an Indigenous person of Yaqui and Apache Native American ancestry, and as a member of the Baha'i community. The ideas expressed are not official U.S. government policy. And also, I want to take just a moment, since I am in Northern Virginia, to acknowledge that I am on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchitane, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey peoples, and we honor their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, as was mentioned in the introduction, I work here in Washington, D.C., but I am originally from the Southwestern United States, born in Arizona and raised in New Mexico from parents of Apache and Yaqui ancestry. I come from a family of Indigenous storytellers, of writers, of artists, of scholars, and poets. Now, most people are familiar with my father's people. When I mention the Apache, people are familiar with the famous Apache of the Southwestern United States. This will include Geronimo or Cochise, others like Mangas or Victorio, and so many others. However, for those not familiar with my mother's people, the Yaqui or the Yoeme, we also are known, I've included a slide here on the screen, and I thought just a very brief introduction would be helpful as we discuss a framework for unity. So very briefly, the Yaqui are traditionally from northern Mexico and southern Arizona. The tribe, I would say, has lived a life of resistance, first facing Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s, and then later against the Mexican government. The Mexican government that enslaved members of the Yaqui tribe, enslaved them to work the sugarcane and the tobacco plantations thousands of miles from our traditional homeland. And this was, of course, under very brutal conditions. The government also forced Yaqui women to marry non-native men in an effort to destroy the indigenous culture and way of life. Over 2/3 of Yaqui slaves died within their first year of their enslavement, again, due to the harsh and brutal conditions. Now, the Yaqui would continue to fight for their rights and eventually receive land recognition from Mexico in 1939, but it would take a little bit longer for the U.S. government to make that same decision. But eventually, the tribe would be recognized by the U.S. government. And I would be remiss if I didn't share the photo of my great-grandparents on the bottom corner of the slide. And I want to underscore their resilience and their fight for freedom against slavery. And I also must recognize my brother also on this slide, who is the Yaqui deer dancer. Now, as we explore race unity and the need for a global solution, a global framework, I believe it is important to have a definition or an understanding of what keeps us apart. It's important, I believe, to understand the effects of racism and how it prevents members of all communities from achieving their true potential. Now, on this topic, the Universal House of Justice, which is pictured here on the slide, the Universal House of Justice is the supreme governing institution of the Baha'i faith. The House of Justice issued a powerful letter in July of 2020. Now, the letter was in response to calls for social change and racial justice that took place in America during that time. And this was sparked by the murder of George Floyd. Now, in the letter, very powerful letter, the Universal House of Justice defines the effects of racism. And I'd like to read a quote from that letter, which is also on the screen. And I quote, "Racism deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while belighting the progress of the rest of humankind. It cannot be rooted out by contest or conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all. And again, end quote. Let me thank again the Wilmot Institute once again for bringing us together, because I believe this is why we have all gathered here tonight, to build and to fortify these just relationships in our communities, in all our communities, wherever we live, in order to uplift everyone. Now, as highlighted here on the slide in this quote, not allowing for a diverse discussion of thought by diverse participants hinders humanity's ability, hinders our community's ability to achieve its collective destiny. Historically, I would say as an Indigenous person, that Indigenous peoples have played an important role in the support of race unity in this country and around the world. And we'll see a few examples of that shortly. But at present, Indigenous peoples, we have been noticeably absent, I would say excluded and marginalized from this important conversation. Indigenous peoples must play a productive role in this conversation if we, all of us, are to achieve our true potential as a global community. Now, when I was in my early 20s, which was a very, very, very long time ago, I went off to study abroad in Cambridge, England. And it was at that time that I became familiar with the writings of author and activist James Baldwin, who's pictured here on the slide. Now, some of you might recall in the 1960s, James Baldwin participated in a debate on race at Cambridge University. And this was where the same college where I studied many years later. Now, during that debate, Baldwin gave such a powerful testament of what it's like to grow up as an African American. Baldwin's words had a profound influence on me as an Indigenous person. I'd like to share his words with you here. Rather long quote, but it's so powerful, it's just too hard to break up. So I quote, "Born in that glittering US Republic, and the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white. And since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper and the cowboys in the movies killing off the Indians, when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another only on the basis of the color of their skin begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime to the present, when you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen." End quote. The, again, powerful words of Mr. James Baldwin. Baldwin's words had a profound influence on me as a young man because of the powerful image, I would say the social discourse on racial identity, the way we see ourselves and the way others see us. The words of James Baldwin for me were the very first time that someone outside of my immediate family understood my feelings of anger, of frustration, and mistrust. Baldwin provided a sense of empathy and understanding. Now, as people of color, we know that we are different. But I would emphasize, however, there comes a time in this country and around the world when the reality of being different, being a person of color, is made evident. when that reality is ingrained in one's memory forever by someone else's action. Now, I believe it's important to take a few minutes to examine ethnic and racial identity from an Indigenous perspective. Now, here on the slide, I would say this is the way that non-Indigenous people have been conditioned to see us, to see Native peoples. In our native regalia, possibly living in some faraway territory or reservation. To some people, this slide is comfortable. To some people, this is normal. To some, it's reassuring. The noble savage, living in the past, a historical relic, a museum piece, a sports mascot. Now, on the slide here is actor Chief Iron Eyes Cody. Now, the Chief was a famous actor in the 1970s, and I grew up in the 1970s, and I remember as a child seeing him in television commercials on the importance of protecting the environment. So every Saturday, as a child, after watching cartoons, a commercial would come on, and there was Chief Iron Eyes Cody. Now, I grew up knowing my heritage. I grew up knowing my culture, but I was, to be very honest, I was confused. Confused because here is a Native American on television that, for one, didn't dress like me. He often dressed like he lived in the 1800s. He dressed like he lived in the past. He dressed in full buckskin regalia with feathers in his hair. At the age of 8 years old, it made me question who I was. Made me question my identity. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the tribe of Chief Iron Eyes Cody. The chief is from Sicily. He was not Native American. He was born in Sicily. But someone thought he'd make a great Indian on television, and one of the greatest stereotypes was born. Just think about the toxic mix of emotions at such a young age. Just like James Baldwin stated in the previous slide, something happens around the age of 5 or 6 or 7, or in my case, at the age of 8 years of age. For generations, this is what we were supposed to look like. For me, it was watching a fictitious representation of a Native person on television and being told this was the standard. Again, we see how false narratives affect the progress of different communities. So to correct some of the misinformation, let me just share a few, very few important facts before we continue. Now, the first fallacy is not all Native Americans live on the reservation. In fact, 80% of Native Americans, 80% of us live off of the reservation. And 60% of Native Americans also live in urban areas. So the majority of Native Americans live off the reservation and live in urban areas. That said, when I give this type of presentation, I'm often asked during the Q&A session, so which state then has the largest population of Indigenous peoples? Some guesses that I've heard in the past include Arizona. Some have said Colorado. I've heard Alaska. Good guesses, all three really good guesses, but all incorrect, all wrong. This U.S. state with the largest Indigenous population is California. California, home to Hollywood, right? Movie stars, Disneyland, and also the state with the largest population of Indigenous peoples. I'm also often asked which U.S. city has the largest Indigenous population. In the past, I'm from Arizona. In the past, I've heard Phoenix. Great guess. Some have said Santa Fe, Oklahoma City, Anchorage, Alaska. All really good guesses. but all wrong. The US city with the largest indigenous population is New York City. New York City is home to over 100,000 indigenous peoples. So I ask you this evening, for a short time, put aside everything you read about Native peoples. Put aside everything you've seen on television or in the movies. Put aside everything you thought you knew about Native peoples and just listen. Listen to a unique indigenous perspective on race unity. And let me say this, as we discuss race unity, and this is an important data point, and it's actually here on the slide. I've included on the slide, it's the third bullet. There are over 475 million indigenous peoples living around the world in over 90 countries, the majority of which live in Asia and not the Americas. So the majority of indigenous peoples live in Asia. So let me add with this. With nearly 500 million indigenous peoples living around the world, serving as stewards and leaders on the environment, on global governance, on gender equality, and so many other issues vital to our survival as a global community, I would add this, that society must not categorize indigenous peoples as historical figures whose time has passed, but instead look to Native peoples as a significant element in the spiritualization of humanity, the construction of a unified world, and the establishment of a global civilization. Now, as we take a historical view of race unity in this country and the prominent role African Americans and indigenous peoples have played together, it's important to acknowledge that historically one of the very first individuals to publicly acknowledge the prominent role of indigenous peoples and people of African descent in the United States was not an American. Instead, it was a man named Abdu'l-Bahá, who was born in Persia and lived from 1844 to 1921. His picture's here on the slide. Abdu'l-Bahá was the son of the Prophet Baha'u'llah. And to Baha'is, Abdu'l-Bahá is seen as an exemplar of how we should conduct our own lives. In 1912, Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to the United States, and it was during his visit to America that he affirmed that the United States had a special contribution to make in world affairs. Again, a special contribution to make in world affairs. And he added that America would achieve its special destiny when it confronted its most challenging issue, racial prejudice. It was during his visit, during Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to America in 1912, in support of people of African descent, Abdu'l-Bahá urged audiences throughout the United States, audiences in New York City, in Los Angeles, California, in Chicago, in Denver, San Francisco, and also during a talk to an audience of over 1,000 participants at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Abdu'l-Bahá urged white and Black members of the audience to confront what he called the most challenging issue in the United States, again, racial prejudice. Abdu'l-Bahá also called for racial integration in that same speech at Howard University. And think about this, 42 years before the US Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education verdict that outlawed racial segregation in public schools. Now I want to emphasize, absolutely emphasize the historical significance of Abdu'l-Bahā's message and action, support and action in support of African Americans at a time in this country when Jim Crow, racial terror, segregation, dehumanization, this was the norm of American society. In 1912, this was a sustained and a very public challenge to the racial ideologies that supported the color line in American life. And I want to emphasize that this is something that no other prominent visitor to the United States had ever done. This is truly a historic moment, not only in the history of the Baha'i faith, but in the history of the United States. Now, in support of Indigenous people, there are not many historical examples of public support for Indigenous peoples in the United States during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Believe me, I have searched. Some might ask why. Why the lack of public support for Native Americans during this time frame, during the late 1800s and early 1900s? It's because during that time frame, the United States was at war with its Native American population. It was conducting a genocide to exterminate Native peoples. However, in support of the prominent role Indigenous peoples will play, Abdu'l-Bahá stated the following in 1916, and the quote is here on the screen: "Attach great importance to the Indigenous population of America. Should they be educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will be so illumined as to enlighten the whole world." Abdu'l-Bahá, 1916. Now, here we are together, September 2024. It would be absolutely appropriate to say that Indigenous peoples will play a prominent role, or that Indigenous peoples should play an important role in society. Absolutely appropriate, no doubt. But the message revealed by Abdu'l-Bahá was delivered in 1916. What was happening in our country at this time, 1916? It's a time in U.S. history when boarding schools were being used by the U.S. government to forcibly assimilate Native American children. Native children were forcibly taken from their families, not allowed to speak their own language, not allowed to pray in their traditional way, forced to end the practice of traditional culture. The motto of the day was "Kill the Indian and save the man," or as one boarding school survivor shared with me, the motto was "Assimilate or exterminate." Now, we are all too familiar with the beatings, the sexual abuse, the untold number of deaths that took place at these boarding schools. I would add that Abdu'l-Bahā's recognition of Indigenous peoples came at a time when Native Americans were not even citizens of our own country. We would not become U.S. citizens until 1924. But here is Abdu'l-Bahā's message delivered in 1916. It's only been 100 years that Native peoples have been U.S. citizens. And here is a man, Abdu'l-Bahá, born in Persia, delivering a profound message in support of my ancestors and generations to come, in support, again, of the powerful and prominent role Indigenous peoples will play in enlightening the entire world. Not the region, not the country, but the entire world. Again, these are his words, not mine. In the Baha'i writings, there are many powerful and profound quotes on the promotion of racial equality, social justice, unity. However, tonight I want to focus on a particular quote in the Baha'i writings that states what is required to bring about the oneness of humanity, what is required to overcome discrimination, and what is required to overcome prejudice. What is required and I quote, is an inescapable obligation to nurture, encourage, and safeguard every minority belonging to any faith, race, class, and nation within it. The inescapable obligation, I would say, is central to the Baha'i writings, and I believe central to bringing about the unity of humanity. If I had to summarize the inescapable obligation, I would say it is the selfless and courageous acts to protect, to promote, and to help advance other members of humanity. Now, I want to share and highlight a few examples of this inescapable obligation that have taken place between Indigenous peoples and African Americans to showcase this important framework that helped to advance the unity of humanity in this country and around the world. Now, the courageous acts of the inescapable obligation between African Americans and Native Americans is absolutely well documented during the time of the Underground Railroad. Many of the routes that slaves took on their way to freedom in the north and routes in the south that led into Mexico ran through Native American settlements. And I would say this was for obvious reasons. This is where members of Native American tribes, like those in the north, such as Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Anishinaabe tribes, and other Native American tribes, took in slaves that escaped on their way to freedom and provided them with safety from slave catchers and bounty hunters that were in direct pursuit. Now, later, these same tribes would provide them with safe passage to Canada and freedom in the north, and the indigenous tribes living along the US-Mexican border provided safe passage to freedom in the south into Mexico. Now, other documented examples of the inescapable obligation can be seen on a global level. In 1911, author and activist W.E.B. Du Bois and Charles Eastman. For those not familiar with Charles Eastman is pictured here on the corner with the bow tie and the suit. Charles Eastman was the first Native American to graduate and be certified in Western medicine. Now, these two men represented the United States and their respective communities at the Universal Races Congress held in London, England. Now, the objective of the International Congress was to bring together like-minded individuals from around the world to discuss racial prejudice and the effects of colonialism. And both of these men presented papers on how African American and Native peoples could usher in an anti-colonial future, and there was also discussion on the importance of racial equality. Now, some might dismiss, and some have dismissed, the URC, the Universal Races Congress, because it was a one-time event. It took place 1911, London, England, first and only time. However, I would say this was a remarkable first step, a groundbreaking step. It set a path by African Americans and Indigenous peoples working in collaboration to expand the idea that racism in the United States and the ability to achieve unity was not solely a US domestic issue, it was a global issue that needed a global solution, a global framework. And as Baha'is, we know the case for world peace is directly linked to success in resolving the issue of racial injustice. And it's important to underscore and to note that Abdu'l-Bahá was also invited to participate in this very same Congress. Unfortunately, he was unable to participate in person, but he was able to share a letter that was read and shared with members of the Congress. And the last example that I want to include here, this includes the writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, a true civil rights icon. And here in this quote, Dr. King is taking the opportunity to support a distinct community outside of his very own African American community and amplifying in his own writings the tragic history faced by Native Americans before the transatlantic slave trade. And I believe it's important in this quote to underscore how Dr. King refers to the injustice faced by Native peoples to illustrate how oppression faced by African Americans and Native Americans are part of a broader history of exploitation and marginalization faced by both groups in this country. And what I find very powerful about this quote from Dr. King is how he illustrates how this oppression was not unique to a particular group, but again, part of a broader history. And I quote Dr. King here, "Our nation was born in genocide when it enshrined the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were a large number of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, but blood flowed in the battle over racial superiority." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., 1964, Why We Can't Wait. So, how is the inescapable obligation and the historical framework shared between African Americans and Indigenous peoples central to bringing about the unity of humanity? I would say, and I absolutely believe, it is important to underscore that advancing and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, advancing and protecting the rights of all people of color, ensures more stable and inclusive societies, more prosperous economies, and more peaceful nations, because it absolutely does. Besides being the morally right thing to do, I would add that it is in our global security interest. We have to look beyond our own border. So I would say it's in our global security interest to address inequities faced by Indigenous peoples, to address inequities faced by all people of color. Because regional conflicts around the world demonstrate how marginalized groups are subject to compounding and disproportionate harm. However, societies that successfully address deep-rooted disparities tend to be, again, more peaceful, more prosperous, and more stable. And that is inherently good for all of us as a global community. Now, more than a century ago, Baha'u'llah wrote, and I quote, "The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until unity is firmly established," end quote. Now, as Baha'is, we are also aware that achieving world peace, as I mentioned earlier, that achieving world peace is directly linked to success in resolving the issue of racial injustice. My global mandate in the work that I do overseas is to partner with foreign government officials and Indigenous peoples to ensure that U.S. foreign policy protects and advances the rights of Indigenous peoples and the rights of marginalized communities around the world. Now, we do this not, and I have to underscore, not because we have solved these challenges here in the United States. We haven't. But rather because we recognize that these are global challenges that require coordinated and sustained global solutions. When I give this type of presentation, what usually happens is that people recognize the power that exists in our diversity. They recognize the need to work together and to collaborate. They are inspired, no doubt inspired by the historical framework between African Americans and Indigenous peoples. However, what happens when I'm asked to join let's say, an informal discussion or a working group to discuss race unity initiatives, what happens is that instinctively, these same people say that confronting racism and support for race unity is a black and white issue that needs to be addressed by members of these groups only. My friends, racism is a global issue that needs a global solution, a global framework. And I would offer, in this country, we have been conditioned to believe that race unity is solely an issue between one group of people and another group of people. Racism requires a global solution, as we have been counseled in the Baha'i faith. I would add that Abdu'l-Bahá did not support the African American community only. Abdu'l-Bahá did not support indigenous peoples only. Abdu'l-Bahá was focused on helping all communities, as we explored in the previous slides. He stood in support of the African American community while standing in support of indigenous peoples and so many other communities. Now, to illustrate this point, I want to share the power of the Native American medicine wheel. It's here on the screen. Now, the medicine wheel is also known as the sacred hoop, and it is used by indigenous tribes in the US and indigenous peoples all around the world as a symbol of healing and health. Now, the medicine wheel comes in many different forms, but usually it indicates the 4 directions, as you can see on the screen: north, south, east, and west. Medicine wheel is also aligned with sacred duties, characteristics, some might say virtues, others will say responsibilities that are bestowed on each of us as a member of a global community. Now, the medicine wheel also represents the people of the 4 directions: white, black, red people, and those from the Far East. Now, as a wheel, it shows that unity is not achievable unless and until all of us are part of the solution, and all must play an active role. However, much of the discussion on race unity in this country, I would say, has been examined through a binary approach. A binary approach is known to sociologists, to strategists, to negotiators as a classic high conflict trap. This means it promotes adversarial views, and the end game is a winner and a loser. A binary approach also only supports 2 prominent and competing viewpoints, and you can see this by these 2 men tug of war, pulling on the same rope. 2 competing viewpoints, again, black and white, left or right, etc. The consequence of a binary approach is that it reinforces what we already believe is true and dismisses new perspectives. But the medicine wheel, which I would say is a visual model or visual representation of the inescapable obligation, is designed to exploit human capacity for cooperation, consultation, and unity. And I humbly offered as a model to expand the conversation on race unity in this country and around the world. The other approach, the binary approach, is designed to promote competition and conflict. Now, it is hard to predict the future. I recall growing up in the 70s, as I mentioned, I grew up in the 1970s, and I recall being told as a child, being told by the year 2024 would be here that I would be the proud owner of a flying car. It's 2024 and I'm still not the owner of a flying car, and I'm okay with that. I realize it's just not going to happen. That's okay. Some predictions do not always come true. What is predicted and what will come true is that Black and brown people will be the majority population of this country. Marginalized communities in America will make up the majority of the nation's population by 2050. by 2050, Hispanic Americans are expected to have the greatest population growth, an increase of about 6%. In fact, people of Latino, Hispanic origin will be the majority population in the US by 2060. It will be Black and brown people that will be leading the conversation on race unity. And this is a powerful, powerful event in our nation's history and the history of the world. What I also find absolutely incredible is that 25 to 35% of individuals that consider themselves Latino or Hispanic also self-identify as being indigenous from countries around the world. Now, remember, you might recall the 475 million indigenous peoples from around the world that I mentioned earlier. Here are some of them. In conclusion, let me say this. Let me say that in our pursuit to achieve unity in this country and around the world, I believe it is time to move from the binary approach to a holistic model like the medicine wheel, a framework that better represents the world we live in and the world we want to live in. I would say it's time to move away from a binary model that limits the sharing of unique perspectives and limits full participation. With that, I want to thank you for your time. I am again truly honored to have the opportunity to share my thoughts and perspectives. So thank you once again. With that, I will turn it back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orona, for this amazing presentation. There's so many aspects of what you shared that are so critical for not only people living in the United States, but truly all of humanity. We have to really realize the essential role, the prominent role, as you said, that Native peoples, people of African descent, and as the Universal House of Justice described, three groups of historical significance, right? Indigenous peoples, people of African descent, and immigrants. So when we realize how deprived humanity is when we don't have these perspectives, when we don't have equity, we will, I think, start to change our thinking, our institutions, and the way in which we function. So from our audience, thank you also for being here. We're now able to take your questions if you'd like to post some of your Q&A in there. While you do that, I wanted to kick off the question Q&A by asking, there are so many of our sectors in society that suffer because we don't have the indigenous perspective, whether it's medicine and healing, whether it's agriculture, how we, environmental degradation as a result of monoculture, and all of the food industry and so forth, which relates to our macro level health and all of that. It seems that indigenous wisdom is still not within our educational system. We know that in some states, African American studies, for example, is not allowed in high schools. Can you share a little bit with us about the potential or progress of having indigenous studies within our high schools and universities?
No, thank you for that. And that's a great question to start off the conversation. This is my own experience, and others may have a different experience, and I welcome that. It's my own experience that unfortunately it should be larger and at a bigger rate than it is now. And unfortunately, that's not happening. I would say in some sectors, in some colleges, in some in some localities, in some regions of the country, it's far more advanced. I come from Arizona, and the universities there, and you have maybe more of an opportunity to discuss and to understand Native culture, Indigenous language, Indigenous knowledge. But here on the East Coast, I would say where I'm living now, it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult. It's rare here on the East Coast, and others may have a similar vision or understanding. I will say this though my position allows me to travel around the world and meet with Indigenous peoples from around the world, and I will say that there's a growing understanding, for lack of a better term, a revolution taking place among Indigenous peoples around the world who are coming forward, stepping forward, and absolutely sharing and taking advantage of this opportunity, taking advantage of every platform available to share Indigenous knowledge, to share Indigenous culture, and what this culture, this experience can bring to this world. I'm seeing it around the world, and I'll be honest, I'm seeing it coming from Indigenous women. Indigenous women around the world are making such headway, are making just amazing advances on protecting, on advancing the rights of their communities, of advancing the rights of Indigenous knowledge. It is amazing what our Indigenous sisters are doing and how they're doing it. And this is absolutely increasing. And this is so, I'm delighted. And it's just a powerful movement that's taking place.
Thank you so much. In the Q&A, there's some comments appreciating your work. One person is really looking forward to your book coming up. And there's a question here about how do we create the vision of one humanity at a local level?
Well, fabulous question. And I think that's so important. We have to look at what's available locally, where we live, and to be active and to participate. It's about being active. It's about being aware of our surroundings, being aware of our community. That said, the first thing I would say, as we look for opportunities locally, and we should be looking for opportunities locally, we should roll up our sleeves and volunteer and look for opportunities to be of service. But that said, I will say this, that it's important, one, to be educated and to understand maybe the historical significance of issues and problems that exist, and how we want to help support that, and how we want to help support these communities. But before that, I would say, why? What is the motivation? What is your motivation to be of service? What is the motivation to be of service to a particular community? And that's something we all have to take part in and reflect on our own privately, to say, what is my motivation to be active in a particular community? Is it to be a hero on a white horse to come and rescue a particular group? Is it because it makes you feel good? There's a long and tragic history of people trying and wanting to be of service to Native peoples, and it wasn't a very good history. And so I absolutely applaud that people need to be active and engage, and I absolutely support that. But I would just say the first step is to look why and understand the why. What is that motivation? The second thing that I would just underscore is, when you do participate and when you do engage locally, and you find those opportunities, which are absolutely needed, and we absolutely welcome those opportunities. We should take more advantage of them. When you find those opportunities, to please don't see yourself as a voice for the voiceless. And I'm coming from an Indigenous perspective. Indigenous peoples have agency. We have always had agency. We've had 1,000 years of experience. We have the understanding. We have traditional knowledge. We have frameworks to share with all of you. So it's not about being a voice for the voiceless. We have a voice. and we have agency. The issue is that we haven't always been allowed to be part of that consultation, to share that perspective. And so it's an opportunity for us to be able to share that perspective. So when you do reach out and you do advance and you do look for service opportunities, I strongly encourage all of us to walk in humility, to be humble in our approach, to be ready to learn and be ready to support, and not so much to lead.
Thank you so much. So vital to listen and not lead. There's a question here from Sue St. Clair, our dear friend. I've been exposed only a bit to the aspects of the medicine wheel, and it appears from the image you shared, each one of the colors have their own qualities and gifts. Can you share if this is currently being incorporated in educating people what to move from, in order to move, I believe, from the binary approach to a more holistic approach?
Thanks, Sue. I'm glad that Sue is here. Fantastic. Great question. There are many different types of medicine wheels, very different types of illustrations. They're used in many different ways. The reason I chose this one is because it does have those virtues, those characteristics of each of the people of the four directions. And I wanted to show that because it's important that what we bring to the table, all of us need to come to this table and be part of this, because we have so much to offer, so many different characteristics, so many different strengths and skills to offer this world. And so that's why I use that, Sue. So great question. And that's why I will continue to use that version, because it shows the power of the strength that we all bring and all need to share, so that we can create this vision of a unified humanity.
Thank you, Michael. The next question is, the statement "being Black in America is a construct" refers to the idea that racial categories, including Blackness, are not based on inherent biological differences, but are instead social and cultural constructs that have been created and maintained through historical, political, and social processes. This concept is rooted in critical race theory and sociological understanding of race. Then there's an elaboration about the historical development of this, and the lack of biological basis. Modern genetic research has shown that there is more genetic variation within, and I'm sorry it got chopped off. Oh, here, okay, there. Whoa, this is an amazing question. There's 9 paragraphs here. With permission with the anonymous participant, I'm going to try and summarize some of these points. And if Dr. Orona, you'd like to elaborate on any of these, we invite you to do so. If you'd like to move on, we can certainly do that. So there are points about intersectionality. Of course, we know that if there's any discussion of taking a more holistic approach and being non-binary in our discussions about race, racial unity and justice in this country, intersectionality is critical. Power dynamics are another issue that are brought up, the impact of identity, systemic implication, and much more. But I don't want to keep throwing out different concepts, but if there is one you'd like to elaborate on, we certainly would welcome that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And maybe you can share that later and I can take a look at it privately. But thanks for the question. Absolutely. First and foremost, the movement away from the binary approach is grounded on the belief that we only see 2 different groups that are participating in this conversation on race and race unity. So my idea of non-binary is to increase the perspectives, increase the participation, like the medicine wheel, of so many other communities to be more involved, including my own that has been marginalized from the conversation for too long, especially given our important history that you saw. And that's just a tiny bit of the history that Native peoples have in race unity in this country. We haven't even talked about the world yet, so we can do another one on another topic on the global perspectives that Native peoples bring to this. But on the importance of that. So I want to make sure that that's understood and absolutely understand, the social construct, and so many other aspects that were raised in that conversation. But first and foremost, and on intersectionality, let me say this, and I've given a talk previously a couple of months back on intersectionality, and again, I mentioned the powerful dynamic of and the powerful role Indigenous women are playing. If we look at intersectionality, I look to my sisters, my Indigenous sisters, and talking about intersectionality, what they face as being Indigenous, what they face as being as women and being marginalized in so many countries because of that. First and foremost, being Indigenous, and then being a woman, and it goes on and on. So absolutely understand, absolutely, and this is crucial and this is critical, and that's why I want to move beyond the binary discussion so that we can talk about those important issues, so we can talk in greater detail of what it means to be Indigenous. But if we're stuck in the binary approach between black and white conversation, then we never get to those important conversations about being Indigenous, about being a woman, and what that means, and the power that lies in all of that. So hopefully that's helpful. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Before we go to the next question, I want to piggyback on this a little bit. So when we think about the historically significant populations that the Universal House of Justice speaks about, you in your answer shared about race, the binary, and gender, about your sisters and the amazing work that's being done with indigenous women at the forefront. The other aspect that I wanted to ask about is class. So we have race, gender, class as our intersectionality at this point in this discussion. That third population being immigrants. When immigrants come to the United States, as my family did, there is such a strong negative force of materialism, upward mobility towards the American dream that is embedded in materialistic notions of progress. I feel that a lot of immigrant families get caught up in that because the purpose of coming is to have a better life, and the focus on material progress and the acquisition of things deprives us of searching for truth, searching for the true history of the country that we've come to, and the peoples that will actually liberate all of humanity. So again, this is kind of a question more specifically. Sorry that I'm taking the liberty to talk about even more specific Persian Baha'is who have fled, Iran to come for religious freedom. But maybe what can our role be? Immigrants as a general population, and then more specifically Persian Baha'is. You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I gave my answer. I hope you enjoyed it. No, so on immigrants, absolutely, it's been my experience that the immigrants to this country have come and to focus on the next generation, to focus on their children and producing and giving them an opportunity to succeed, whether it's better education opportunities and that leading to better professional experience and opportunities in college and beyond. And when you see the opportunities that exist and you see the end result and how powerful it is and how the unique perspective that was also the third group that you mentioned that isn't talked about, that is also forgotten. It's important that we bring them to the table to share those perspectives, unique perspectives on what it is to come to this country and how it is important to include them in this very conversation and not be dismissed because they were not born here. On the Persian aspect, I'm not Persian, so I won't deal too deep in that, but I will say, and I've said it to others before, the Persian community, for those that are unaware, the Persian community is the majority population of the Baha'i faith. And like any majority population, there's a responsibility that goes with that. I would say, and this is my own my own thoughts, from my own perspective, as the majority population in the faith, that it is important to offer and make sure that platforms are being used to talk about and provide these perspectives, whether it's an Indigenous perspective, whether it's a perspective from refugees, whether it's an idea, perspectives, thoughts. It's important to provide this platform. And so again, we all have a responsibility, as it mentioned in the medicine wheel. And I would just say, as the largest population in the faith, encourage you to use those numbers to increase the platforms so that these perspectives are understood, heard, and embraced.
Indeed. Thanks. There's also a question. How has the vision of Abdu'l-Bahá for American Indians affected you and your family?
I told you, as I shared in the previous slide, I mean, in one of the very first slides when I mentioned James Baldwin as a young man, how I felt marginalized, right? I felt a sense of anger at times and alone and wanting to be heard. And I think that's natural at such a young age to have those type of feelings and want to be understood, want to be seen first and foremost. And I felt I wasn't. And so when I read books by Baldwin and others about race identity, and it made me feel a particular way. But as I deepened and became familiar with the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and specifically the number of quotes that talk about the promise that my people will play in bringing about the humanity, a better world. How could I not, and my family not be empowered to be part of that process? Because it's rare. It's absolutely rare. As you mentioned, and you started, Chitra, the first question, where is this idea or knowledge of our past on Native Americans and traditional history, traditional knowledge, where is it being taught? It's rare that it is. But here we have a man that delivered these outstanding message, this powerful message in 1916 that absolutely highlights, underscores the power that our communities, our Indigenous communities can and will play. It was empowering. It still is. It still is. And that's why I turn to these writings every day, because I'm not forgotten. I need to be heard. And I've been told, and my my ancestors and the next generation behind me, my children, have a voice, and they will play a prominent role in changing this world. Absolutely, it's promised.
Indeed. Someone is asking about any content creators on social media that you would recommend. I guess in our learning process, right? We're on our screens a lot, and I think it would be helpful to know if you have any recommendations, or it can be offered later as a, if you'd like to offer resources later for our YouTube page.
Yeah, let me think about that one. That's a good question. I'll have to think about it. I'm on social media, but not as quite active as others are. So I'd have to take a minute to think about that. But I would love to get back to you on that one though. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, maybe this is a great segue to share a little bit about your book that will be released soon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So this is the book, The Brave Ones. And to have a copy, it'll be out next month. It's been a long time coming, and it'll be online very soon, Barnes and Noble and any places that you buy your books online. And it is in support of my mother's people, the Yaqui, the Yoame people. And I gave a brief introduction of what they faced in the Southwest. Before there was a border between Mexico and the United States, the Yaqui people lived in northern Mexico, what is now southern Arizona, northern Mexico, northwest Mexico. And so they traveled freely throughout that region. Once a border was established, it was much more difficult. And we faced we faced the brutality of being enslaved and so many things that I mentioned earlier. This book is a history of my mother's family and their fight for equality, their fight as newcomers to this country who came from Mexico as indigenous peoples. We talked about refugees, and I know a little bit about that as well. And their fight for equality, for education, for dignity in this country. And so if you get the opportunity when it's out, I encourage you to read it, and I'd love to hear back from you about it and what you think. But it's a new perspective. And I will say this, that for so long, indigenous peoples have been stereotyped, have been marginalized, forgotten in the media, in literature. And we've always played, especially in literature, it's frustrating. It's very rare that we are the protagonists. It's very rare that we are the main characters in the story. This entire story is Native people being the protagonists, Native people at the forefront, and what we have done and can do. There's a surprise in the end, and I won't say what it is, but how we come together and we work together and achieve this powerful idea of the unity of humanity. So next month it'll be out, so I encourage you. So thank you for that, the plug. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're so grateful, and thank you so much for being here. Maybe we'll do two more questions. And for those of you who have written more substantially, please know that Dr. Orona will get the things that you've written. How can we address the trauma that marginalized peoples have suffered?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. That's a powerful question. By providing platforms for us to share, whether it's through arts and entertainment, whether it's through books, whether it's through talks, to share the history, to share the knowledge and understanding that we have as I would say from indigenous perspectives, from indigenous peoples, to provide platforms to share these ideas, to talk and to understand what has happened. It's important to acknowledge the history. I'm not saying we have to live in the history, right? But we need to. It's important to acknowledge the history that exists and what marginalized communities have faced. And we need, that's part of the process. That's part of the medicine wheel process. And that's part of the responsibilities and the virtues that are brought, and the skills and the tools that each of us bring to the table, is that those unique perspectives. And we need to be able to voice those and share those.
Absolutely. The last question is actually about how this recording, can be accessed. So please know that on the Wilmette Institute YouTube page, all of these recordings are available. You can share them with others. I really, really believe that having these important webinars and truly expressing our appreciation for you, Dr. Orona, for making the time to share your personal experience, professional experience with us is greatly appreciated. We really look forward to part 2 of this. As you mentioned, we'd love to have the global aspect as well. And for those of you who participated and posted your questions, we thank you for being here on a Friday night with us. Please do join us for our next webinar coming up, and check out the Wilmette Institute website for all of the offerings we have. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Orona, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.